but they're constantly changing. Our body is constantly changing. We can know that from science because our body's made up of small particles like cells, molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. And these are not fixed and frozen, static things, but they're constantly changing. Our body is changing every single minute, every second, every nanosecond. But our mind is also changing. It doesn't stay the same from one moment to the next. We're always having different experiences, different thoughts, emotions, perceptions. So it's constantly changing. So everything that makes us up is changing, subject to change, not fixed and frozen. And it's also affected by causes and conditions, circumstances, factors. So, for example, we're affected by external things, the weather, for example. You know, depending on whether it's hot or cold, whether the sun is shining or it's raining or snowing. So this can have an effect on us. Other people, the way people look at us and talk to us and treat us will also have an effect on us. You know, sometimes the way people treat us will make us feel good and happy. Other times it can make us feel miserable and unhappy. So we're affected by that. We're also affected by bigger things in the world, governments, society, the economy. Okay, so there's so many different factors, causes and conditions that affect us and that cause changes to happen to us. But Buddhism also says that we are also affected by more internal factors, our karma and our emotions. We'll talk about that more when we get to the second truth, the truth of the origins of suffering. Because according to Buddhism, our whole existence, coming into existence and going on moment by moment, day by day, year by year, and so on, is mainly affected by karma that we created in the past, not just this life, but past lives as well as factors within our mind, and especially disturbing emotions, afflictive emotions, like greed, hatred, and ignorance. So these are the main factors, the main phenomena, the main causes and conditions that gave rise to our existence in the first place, you know, that brought us into existence and that keep us going moment by moment, day by day, and so on. And because our existence arose from and is affected by or influenced by these factors, karma and delusion, which are impure or imperfect factors, unenlightened factors, then our whole existence is sort of overshadowed by or influenced by suffering. So this is the real reason why we experience suffering, is because we came into existence because of these impure factors. And while we exist, while we live, we are together with, connected with these impure factors. And we, without choice, but just because of the momentum of things, we create even more karma and afflictive emotions that will bring about even more suffering and problems in the future. Does that make sense? It's a little complicated, but this is why the Buddha said just having this body and mind, which are not enlightened, you know, we're not an enlightened being, we're not a being who has attained enlightenment, Buddhahood, or nirvana, we're unenlightened beings. So just the fact that we're in this situation, we're in this kind of condition, that itself is sort of totally caught up in suffering. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a little hard. But actually, I wanted to go on and talk about another list of sufferings, the 3 types of suffering, and maybe this will become a little bit more clear. So it's said that all the different types or varieties or different examples of suffering, of painful experiences, can also be condensed into this list of three types of suffering. So the first of these three is the suffering of suffering, suffering of suffering. And this simply refers to painful experiences, unpleasant experiences that are obviously suffering, that are obviously unpleasant. Nobody has to tell us this is suffering. We know it. So, for example, pain. When we have physical pain or physical discomfort, we don't feel good, we don't feel well. Maybe we feel feverish, we have aches and pains, we feel nauseous in our stomach, or we have a headache or whatever. So when we have those kinds of experiences, then we just know immediately this is suffering, this is painful, this is unpleasant. I don't want this experience. And this is true not just for us, but for all living beings. So animals, insects, every living being will sometimes have this kind of experience, and just instinctively, intuitively, we know this is suffering. So that's the first type of suffering. It's like the most obvious, gross, apparent type of suffering. So that's easy to understand. The second type of suffering is more subtle, more difficult to understand. It's called the suffering of change. And included in this are experiences that normally look like pleasant experiences. What we would normally call pleasure, fun, enjoyment. But as long as they are still included in samsara, or cyclic existence, unenlightened existence, they are considered to be not true pleasure, not real pleasure, but in fact another kind of suffering. And this is not easy to understand. One way we can understand it is that they change, they don't last. So one example that's often given is sitting down. Just this experience of sitting down. If you've been walking for a long time or standing up for a long time, then our legs start to ache and we really want to sit down. So when we first have a chance to sit down, then it feels really good. It feels really pleasant. But then if sitting down was truly a pleasant experience, then it would continue to be pleasant. However much time we remain seated, sitting down, it should continue to be pleasant. But is that what actually happens? I mean, we can know that from here because, after sitting down, whether you're sitting cross-legged on the floor or you're sitting in a chair, sooner or later, it starts to become unpleasant, right? And then sometimes we don't notice it because we're moving all the time, and sometimes the movement just happens without being aware of it. Our body almost like it moves by itself. But if you watch yourself, you watch your what's happening with your body, you'll notice that, you're actually moving a lot, wiggling, shifting position, from one side to another, or moving the leg this way or that way, or straightening your back, whatever. So our body is often, frequently moving in order to find a more comfortable position, because the original one that we had when we first sat down doesn't last, doesn't remain comfortable. Does that make sense? Okay, so sitting down then is not truly pleasurable, because according to this logic, if it was truly pleasurable, it should remain pleasurable and even maybe get better. The longer we sit, it should get better and better all the time. That isn't what happens. And eventually it gets so uncomfortable that we want to stand up. And then standing up feels good. Oh, now we have a break. I can stand up, stretch my legs. This feels really good. But again, if standing up was truly pleasurable, The longer we stand, it should continue to be pleasurable, maybe even get better, but that isn't what happens, right? After standing up for a while, then that becomes unpleasant. That becomes uncomfortable. That becomes suffering, right? And so then again, we sit down. So if you look at what we're doing with our body all day long, we're constantly trying to find a comfortable position. But whatever we do with our body, whatever position we put our body in, whether it's sitting down or standing up or lying down or walking or standing on your head or whatever, eventually that position becomes uncomfortable. So the reasoning, the logic here is that these experiences of sitting and standing and so forth are not truly pleasurable from their own side. They are just, it's actually a lessening of the discomfort that we had previously. So like I said, when we've been standing or walking for a while, that becomes unpleasant, that becomes uncomfortable. And we want to relieve that. We want to stop that discomfort. So we sit down. So the pleasant experience we have when we sit down is really just a relief of the previous unpleasant experience. And so it seems like it's real pleasure, but it's not real pleasure, according to this Buddhist teaching. And another example is eating. Okay, so eating is a pretty, I think for most people, a pleasant experience. We like to eat, and we need to eat. So it's not just a luxury, but it's something essential to stay alive. And so before eating, we might feel some hunger, emptiness in the stomach, and that's unpleasant, that's uncomfortable. So we eat, and initially it feels good, feels pleasant to have some food in our stomach, and that stops the discomfort of hunger. But again, the Buddhist reasoning would say, but if eating itself was truly pleasurable, then we should be able to continue eating, and it would continue to be pleasurable. That doesn't happen, as we probably know, when you go to a buffet and you you can eat all you want. We tend to overeat, and then eating too much it becomes suffering, becomes painful. Okay, so so eating itself is not really a true pleasurable experience. It's just a relief of a previous unpleasant experience, the experience of hunger. So that stopped, and then we have this experience of not having hunger, and that seems like something pleasant, but it isn't truly true pleasure. So this takes usually some time to contemplate, to think about, to get an understanding of. But does it make sense, what I'm saying?
I have a question. So these are examples of things which are not truly pleasurable.
Yeah.
So what are the characteristics of something which is truly?
Right. Okay, that's a good question. So when we say these, these kind of experiences are not real pleasure, not true pleasure, it's said in Buddhism that the only real or true pleasure is that which we experience when we become free of cyclic existence or samsara, when we attain a state of liberation, nirvana, enlightenment. Because when we achieve those states, we experience pleasure or happiness, which doesn't change, which doesn't stop, but it just continues. So it's like continuous happiness, but it's a very different kind of happiness than what we normally consider. It's not dependent on. Another thing is, much of our what we call pleasure is dependent on sensory experiences, being able to see beautiful things, hear beautiful sounds, smell, taste, feel pleasant sensations in our body. And because our body and mind themselves are subject to change, impermanent, then these pleasurable experiences are not permanent. They're changing. And also because they're often dependent on external things. We have to have the right kind of food, the right kind of smells, the right kind of sounds, the right kind of visual objects to feel pleasure. But if they're not available, we may be unhappy. And if the opposite kind of thing presents itself to us, again, that becomes suffering. When we have to hear music that we don't like or sounds that we don't like, then that's really painful. That's really suffering. So the kind of happiness, or I don't really like to use the word pleasure because it's something quite different. Sometimes they call it bliss. The bliss of nirvana, the bliss of enlightenment, is a totally different kind of experience. It's not dependent on external things. It's not dependent on sensory experiences, but it's a mental experience, a mental state, which comes from within. And it's mainly dependent on certain factors in the mind, mainly wisdom, the wisdom that sees the true nature of things, and single-minded concentration. So it arises from those internal factors, and not dependent on or affected by external factors. So they say once, I mean, it's talking about quite a high achievement, but once one has that type of experience, then it lasts, and it's really satisfying, and relieves suffering. Because that's another thing. The pleasant experiences we usually have don't really satisfy us and don't really relieve our suffering. They just give us a kind of temporary break, a temporary respite from our suffering, but they don't really eliminate our suffering. That's why, for example, we eat food and it takes away our hunger, but only for a few hours. Then the hunger comes back. We have to eat again. So it's not like a real long-lasting solution to our suffering. That makes sense? Yeah. Yeah.
But can't I get this kind of mental state you were talking about? Just like cooking, for example, roses or something nice, or smelling something good. Do it always have to go together with something not so nice?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
I'm wondering that if you're trying to get this kind of mental state you were talking about.
Okay, this higher state of bliss and peace, yeah.
But if you concentrate on only the positive, aren't you able to get this mental state?
If you only have positive experiences, looking at beautiful things and so forth, well,
What's the problem with that?
what's the problem with that? Well, for one thing, it's probably impermanent. It's probably something that you experience sometimes, but not all the time, right? It comes and goes, so it's not a permanent thing. And also another thing is, it may, like you use the example of the roses. So if looking at the beautiful roses or smelling the roses, the nice smell of the roses, if that gives you pleasure, but then if the roses die or become rotten, then you're not able to have that experience anymore. And you can say, well, I'll go and buy another bunch of roses, But the thing is, then we're always dependent on external things for that, and that's not always possible. There may be times when we aren't able to get these external objects that we are dependent on in order to have this sort of pleasure. Does that make sense? So that's a limitation, a sort of limitation to that type of pleasure. But then some people say, yeah, but if you can just think positive thoughts. You can think about beautiful things, or you can remember beautiful things, and in that way you can re-experience that. But still, it could be just something impermanent, something that comes and goes. And if you encounter experiences in life that are unpleasant, then that can sometimes overwhelm the pleasant experiences that you have. You know what I mean? It's like you might have beautiful memories from the past, but sometimes things can happen in our life that even though you have these beautiful memories, but your mind just gets totally overwhelmed by these unpleasant things that are happening, like the loss of a loved one, and even if somebody gives you, you're feeling this incredible grief, and somebody may give you a bunch of flowers, or they may play beautiful music for you, but it doesn't work. You know what I'm saying? It's not enough to really remove this suffering that we have. So the kind of happiness I was talking about that is experienced when we achieve liberation and enlightenment is never damaged or disturbed, no matter what happens. It doesn't get, it's not something that's up and down, it comes and goes, but it's continuous and steady. So I'm not talking from experience. I don't have that experience myself, but it's what is described in the Buddhist text. And it said that if we practice meditation and we really work on our mind, develop the right factors within our mind, then we will be able to achieve that kind of happiness and peace. But I think sometimes we might be able to get a little taste of it, a little glimpse of it, sometimes in meditation. When we meditate, there may be times when our mind is more calm and peaceful and satisfied than at other times. So that's like getting a little glimpse, a little taste of this higher level of happiness. But then usually it's temporary, it's transitory, it doesn't last. But at least that can help us to know there is something more, there is something better than our usual, what we normally consider to be pleasure. Does that make sense? Okay, then, so that's the second type of suffering. And then the third one is called pervasive suffering. And this is pretty much equivalent to the last of the eight types of suffering we looked at before. It said that just having this body and mind that are not completely free, but connected with, conditioned by, under the control of karma and delusion, this itself is a suffering. This itself is a state of suffering. So it's like our whole being, our whole existence is in a situation of suffering. And they say this third type of suffering is very hard to understand. We really have to do quite a bit of thinking and meditating to be able to understand it. But I think there's an analogy that might help us to get a better understanding of these three types of suffering and how they're interrelated or interconnected. So the third type of suffering is a bit like being in a prison, which nobody likes. Nobody likes being imprisoned. Animals as well, you put them in a cage, they're very unhappy. So we like freedom. It's just a natural, instinctive thing that we want to be free, to go where we want, to do what we want. We don't like to be imprisoned. So, so I think it's easy to understand that being in a prison is suffering. So this third type of suffering, the pervasive suffering, is like being in a prison, because our existence, our body and mind, we're not totally free. We're not completely free to experience what we want. Even though we may be free to travel, we can travel all over the world, we can go just about anywhere we want to go, and we can eat any kind of food we like to eat, we can live pretty much anywhere we would like. So to a certain extent, we have freedom, but the freedom that we have is limited because, for one thing, having this physical body, right? Having this, as we looked at before, this physical body is subject to change. It's getting older, every day, every month, every year, and even every minute, every second, every moment, our body is getting older. And that's something we can't do anything about. We can't stop that. Okay, it's just a natural process that we're getting older and older and older, and eventually Our body will be, quite an elderly body, and then eventually it will pass away. We have to die. There's no way we can avoid that. So again, nobody really wants to die. Well, that's not completely true. Sometimes people commit suicide, but that's usually because of some, disturbance in the mind. But when people are in a good state of mind, a healthy state of mind, a happy state of mind, they don't want to die. But death is something we don't really want to experience, and yet we don't have that. We don't have the freedom to not die. We don't have the freedom to not get old. We don't have the freedom to not get sick. Nobody wants to get sick. Nobody wants cancer. Nobody wants heart disease. And yet, even if we take good care of our body, good care of our health, eat the right food, still sometimes we can get these diseases that cause so much suffering. Okay, so we don't have total freedom in our life with respect to our physical body, and also with respect to our mind, what's happening in our mind. We don't want to be unhappy. We don't want to have bad thoughts, unhappy thoughts, but sometimes without choice, they just invade us. Our mind just gets invaded by unhappy thoughts. Sometimes it's related to circumstances in our life, but sometimes they just come up without any apparent cause, or reason, because of something happening. Just, you know what I'm saying? You have that experience of this. You wake up in the morning and you're just feeling terrible, and you can't really blame anybody else for it. So again, with our mind, our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences, we don't have total choice or freedom to feel the way we want to feel, to think the way we want to think, right? Is that your experience? Okay, so I think looking at those kind of experiences, which we all have, we can get a sense that we don't have complete freedom. We're not completely free. It's as though we are in a prison, and what makes this prison, what forms this prison, it's not an external prison. It's not like there's walls around us and barbed wire and, guards with guns and so on. It's not that kind of prison, but we are imprisoned by our own delusions, our mental afflictions, ignorance, attachment, anger. We're going to look at these more later when we get to the second noble truth. So those are present in our mind, and also karma. These are the imprints of actions that we did in the past, usually under the influence of delusions, unwise mental states. So we engaged in unwise actions, and so we're still carrying with us the imprints, the effects of our past actions. So those are there in our mind, they're part of us, and it's because of the presence of those that we don't have complete freedom to experience what we want, for things to happen the way we want them to happen. So it's as though we are imprisoned, as though we are not completely free, but forced to experience things due to our own karma and afflictions. So that's hopefully giving some idea of this third type of suffering. It's a lack of freedom, just like being in prison. So that's the third type of suffering. And then, just as in a prison, people who are in prison, they may sometimes have pleasant experiences. For example, you make friends with somebody. You have another prisoner who you become friends with, and then sometimes you get together, you talk, you share stories, you play cards, So at those moments, you might feel good. You might feel happy. You might even forget that you're in a prison. So you have some pleasant experiences. But those pleasant experiences don't last. They're temporary, transitory. It's time to go back to your cells. You have to separate from your friend. You can't be with him anymore. So it's a transitory kind of pleasure that you have. So that's like the second type of suffering. So the second type of suffering of change, is like these pleasant experiences we have while we are in this unenlightened state, and they are pleasant, but they don't last, and they don't really remove our underlying problems, our basic situation of being unenlightened, being unfree. But then also within a prison, the prisoners sometimes have terrible experiences. Like sometimes other prisoners can be really aggressive and vicious and mean and beat each other up. So if you get attacked by another prisoner who's like that, or sometimes the guards themselves can be really nasty. So then you have suffering. That's like real suffering. So that's like the first type of suffering. So I think looking at that analogy of being in a prison, sometimes having pleasant experiences, sometimes unpleasant experiences, can help us have a better understanding of the three types of suffering. Is that helpful? But I think to really understand this third type of suffering, we have to look at the second noble truth, the origin of suffering, how that is explained in Buddhism, which we'll get to later in the afternoon. How afflictions, afflictive emotions or delusions, and karma are the cause for our existence in this unenlightened state, and the problems that we experience, the difficulties we experience. So we're getting close to the end of our time. I wanted to mention one other thing that might be helpful. So the Four Noble Truths are common to the two main traditions of Buddhism, Theravada, or sometimes called Hinayana, which is the type of Buddhism mainly found in Southeast Asian countries such as Thailand and Burma, Sri Lanka, and so on. And then the other main tradition of Buddhism is Mahayana, which is that type of Buddhism that spread more in the northern Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, Mongolia, and so on. And in Tibetan Buddhism, we follow the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. So in both of these traditions of Buddhism, we have the Four Noble Truths, and they're very much emphasized. They're very important topics, but there are some differences in the way that they are explained. And in the Mahayana tradition, in particular in the Tibetan tradition, they follow a particular school of Buddhist philosophy called the Madhyamika. Madhyamika means the middle way. And in that school of philosophy, there's the teaching on emptiness, which is said to be the ultimate truth, the ultimate nature of things. Have you heard of, some of you have probably heard of emptiness before? Yeah, it's a difficult topic. We have to keep hearing about it again and again. But basically, what it means is that our basic problem, the real root of our suffering and all the various kinds of problems that we experience is ignorance. And specifically, there's different kinds of ignorance, but the main kind of ignorance, which is the root of our problems, is an ignorance that doesn't see the true nature of things. So it's as though our mind is covered by a veil that causes us to see things in a mistaken way. We don't see things as they really are. And this is quite subtle, difficult to understand, but I'll try to explain it in a simple way. The way things appear to us is as if they have their own existence from their own side, like they're very real, very solid, very out there, independent. One way of understanding this is things appear as if they stand by themselves independently, not depending on other things for their existence. Okay, so that's how things appear to us. And it's not something that we deliberately and consciously think up. It's like an innate, instinctive, intuitive way that things appear to us, and we just automatically believe that things exist that way. They appear that way, and we believe it. We believe it to be true. But in fact, in reality, things don't exist that way. It's like a totally false, totally mistaken way of existing, because the reality is that everything is dependent, not independent. Everything that exists depends on other things for existence. Nothing stands by itself. Nothing is totally independent. This mistaken way of seeing things applies to our own self, our own sense of self, I, me. So it seems as if there's a real I, a real self, a real me that is existing somewhere within our aggregates, our physical and mental components. There seems to be something in there, a real I, who is like the controller, the boss, the one in charge, the one that makes decisions, the one that moves the body to do this and that, and moves the mind to think this and that. So it seems like there's a real I in there. And we just go through life believing that. Yeah, there's a real I. And then we get very kind of self-important. We feel I'm really important. I'm the center of the universe. Everything revolves around me. So we tend to be rather obsessed with ourselves, self-centered, self-focused, and so on. And then that attitude of self-importance becomes our way of relating to others, other people, and also things in the world around us. So we also usually have a set of likes and dislikes. Certain things we like make us feel good and happy. Other things we dislike, they make us feel unhappy. So then we tend to judge. We tend to discriminate. So certain people that we meet, we find them attractive, we find them pleasant, we find them, they make me feel good. Yeah, they give me happiness. So I like those people. They're good people. And I want to keep them around me as much as possible. I want to stay close to them. I want to make them part of my life. I want them to be my friends, my family, and so on. So there we develop this attitude of kind of attachment, grasping, clinging, wanting those people to be there. And then there are other people we meet, or even if we don't meet them, we hear about them, we come to know about them, and we have the opposite kind of feeling. We feel, oh, I don't like those people. They make me feel bad. They make me feel unhappy, unpleasant, uncomfortable, and so on. So they give me bad feelings, bad vibes. And so then we have the opposite reaction to them. We feel aversion, we feel dislike. We want to keep them far away from us. We want to keep ourselves far away from them. We don't want to be nice to them. We don't even want to look at them or talk to them. We don't even want to hear their name. Okay? So everything about them makes us feel unpleasant. So this happens with people. It also happens with objects, with places, with types of food or sounds or smells. Okay, so we tend to, veer between these two attitudes of liking, grasping, attachment, and disliking, pushing away, rejection. So attachment and aversion, liking and disliking. So this is happening to us all through our life, and even all through our day. If you pay attention to what's going on inside your mind during the day, even when we're sitting and meditating, this can happen. We have sounds that we hear, and sometimes we like them and we want to listen to them, pay attention to them, or we dislike them. We want them to stop and go away, and don't be there. Also with thoughts, certain types of thoughts that come up in our mind, memories, images. Okay, so even just within our mind, different kinds of things can pop up, and we like this one and we don't like that one. We cling to that one, we push that one away. So liking and disliking, attachment, aversion, are experiences that are going on almost constantly in our life. And all of these experiences are really based on a misapprehension or a mistaken way of seeing things. ourself and others, the world, everything. So this is our basic problem. Our basic problem is said to be ignorance, not seeing the true nature of things. Seeing things as if they exist in a much more real and solid way than they actually do. But this doesn't mean things don't exist at all. It doesn't mean there is no me, there's no others, there's no world. It doesn't mean that. There is an I, you exist, I exist, the world exists, things do exist, but they just don't exist the way we normally see them. And so I wanted to talk about this with respect to suffering itself, because we have this mistaken view about suffering when it comes to suffering, whether it's pain, whether it's sickness, whether it's aging, death, unpleasant experiences, and so on. We tend to see these objects as if they were real and solid and independently existing, like they're really there. And because of seeing things in that way, then that's why we have such aversion or fear or dislike towards suffering. So when you hear about these different kinds of sufferings, or you're asked to think about them, to meditate on suffering, or when suffering happens in our life, we have the tendency to see suffering as truly existing, really existing, independently existing. And as long as we see suffering as existing in that way, then we're not seeing it correctly, we're not seeing it accurately. But that way of seeing suffering will probably also lead to these other kinds of emotions like fear, dislike, unhappiness, depression, despair, and so on. So in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, and the Mahayana scriptures, in fact, the Prajnaparamita, the Mahayana tradition is mainly based on a certain set of sutras known as the Prajnaparamita sutras, the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. And in those sutras, the Buddha said that when a bodhisattva is someone who's following the Mahayana path, when a bodhisattva is meditating on the Four Noble Truths, true suffering, origin, cessation path, bodhisattva needs to bear in mind, keep in mind that although these things exist, they don't exist truly. They don't exist inherently. They don't exist independently. Okay, so suffering does exist, but it's not something truly existing, inherently existing, independently existing. So that's difficult to really understand. Later in the afternoon, we'll do some meditation on that to try to get a little bit more understanding. But that, even if we just have a little bit of an understanding of emptiness with regard to suffering and the other noble truths, it really helps. It helps to lighten the experience instead of things being very solid, very concrete. One of my teachers over here, he used to say that we have our way of seeing things is like concrete view. We see things as very concrete. I don't know if you use that expression in your language, but concrete is something really solid, really hard, heavy. So that's our way of seeing things. We tend to see things in a very concrete way. There's a concrete I and a concrete other, whether it's a friend or an enemy, concrete suffering, concrete happiness. We see things as very solid and concrete, but in reality, that's not true. Things don't exist in that way. And even if we can get a little bit of an understanding of emptiness, it helps to soften the concrete view, so that instead of things seeming so solid and concrete, they seem a little bit lighter, more illusory, more dreamlike, more cloud-like, and takes the heaviness out of the experience. Yeah. So then it's easier to look at suffering, meditate on suffering, and not feel so upset about it. Okay, so I'll talk more about that in the afternoon. Maybe we can do some meditation on it as well. So now we have time. We have a break for lunch. So we'll meet again at 1:30 finish time. So enjoy your break. Enjoy your lunch.